It's one of Britain's most celebrated marvels of engineering. A machine that's almost 100 years old. And it's still driving along the main line at 75 miles per hour. Its stories are remarkable, taking us through Britain, the USA, and Australia. He's the most famous and enduring locomotive in the world. A life packed with excitement and adventure. He played a role in the Second World War, defied multiple attempts to scrap him, and even bankrupt some of his owners. Today, after an epic multi-million-pound restoration, Flying Scotsman has returned to his former glory. This is the story of the Flying Scotsman. He is, without a doubt, one of the most beautiful and powerful steam locomotives ever built. He was built shortly after the First World War. He clocked up over 2 million miles. When he was bought by the National Railway Museum in 2004, it was discovered that Flying Scotsman would need the most expensive overhaul. Yet after a decade of hard-working engineers, Flying Scotsman was back on the rails on 2016. And what a welcome he received. Thousands of people watched him go by. But how did he get so popular? The story of the most famous locomotive in the world started way back in the middle of the 19th century in 1862. A daily rail service was introduced linking London and Edinburgh for the first time. The passenger service set off at 10 a.m. on the weekdays. The train could be pulled by any locomotive powerful enough. By 1914, the World War brought even more passengers on the rail system. They needed to transport weapons, coal, fuel, oil, and people all over the country. After the war, rail traffic increased, and the railway company soon realized they would need faster and stronger locomotives. In the Great North Railway, a man was given a task to design bigger, better, and more powerful locomotives. He was called Nigel Greasley. In April 1922, spending years experimenting with several different models, Greasley was ready to test his prototype, now known as the Great Northern. It was bigger and faster than any engine anyone has ever seen before. But they had seen nothing yet. Just a year later, in 1923, Greasley's company built another Pacific locomotive. And it would change everything. It would go on and set world records, and become the most famous locomotive of all time. As work began on building them, a major change was taking place in the railway. The railway companies were merging. And fast. Soon there would be four. One running on the East Coast to mainline, now known as the LNER. And Flying Scotsman started work. But little did they know that this locomotive would become a legend. When LNER opened the 10 a.m. express, connecting England and Edinburgh. Back then, Flying Scotsman was known as 1472. Until LNER decided to give the locomotive a name, and they named him Flying Scotsman. LNER advertised this train as fun and exciting. But Flying Scotsman was destined to get popular using speed. The companies had a brilliant idea of a non-stop train from London to Edinburgh. On May 1, 1928, Scotsman was prepared for the historical run. The station was packed and Flying Scotsman was hooked up and left the station at 11 a.m. Normally it took 8 hours and 15 minutes. But Scotsman arrived 12 minutes early. And he rolled into the station. And the record books. He covered 396 miles without having to stop even once. The railway and the locomotive were gaining popularity. It was a move that assured Flying Scotsman national fame. But that fame would soon be under threat from a new rival. On the 30th of November 1934, Flying Scotsman steamed out of King's Cross. Heading north, the driver chosen for this important test was William Sparchat, well known for his love of speed. Flying Scotsman climbed the Great Hill between Peterborough over 80 miles per hour. It might not sound so fast today, but in the age of steam, that was very, very fast. Although Flying Scotsman was reaching high speed, his driver believed he could go faster. On the journey back to London, the crew gave him everything they got. Tom shoved furiously, trying to build up steam. They started going faster and faster. 70, 75, 80, 90, 95. and they finally reached 100 miles per hour. Flying Scotsman was yet again in the record books. Flying Scotsman became the king of the rails during the 1920s and 30s. He was pulling some of the most luxurious express trains. Flying Scotsman was super famous, but he had a new rival. Built by his own engineer, Nigel Gresley was developing a new locomotive called Mallard. On 3 July 1938, during the trials, Mallard reached a speed of 126 miles per hour. But now with A4s on the front line express. His fame was reducing, but that wasn't all. The Second World War started. The golden age of steam ended. Instead of pulling luxurious trains, he was forced to transport weapons, coal, and soldiers. He was also painted black. In 1941, Nigel Gresley died. After a little time his death, the war ended. The country was being rebuilt and modernized, which would bring dramatic changes to the railway. In January 1948, the 3 railways were nationalized, and the British Railway was born. Trains were losing passengers because of the new methods of transportation. In 1954, the government decided to scrap the steam engines and buy diesel engines. In the late 50s and 60s, thousands of steam engines were scrapped. The Flying Scotsman was about to be scrapped, but some of his fans were outraged. So they started a campaign called Save Our Scotsman. They needed £3,000 or else Flying Scotsman would be scrapped. But the money wasn't coming fast enough to save Scotsman. So Alan Pegler decided to step in and buy the locomotive. Alan Pegler decided to increase the locomotive's fame and repeat the non-stop express on 1 May 1968. The people were pleased. The excitement of steam didn't go away no matter what happened. But Pegler also decided to take Flying Scotsman in the USA for 2 years. Pegler was a very convincing man, and he convinced Harold Wilson to help financially. But in return, Alan Pegler would advertise British companies. So in 1969, Flying Scotsman headed to the US. Everything was fine the first year. But when you go up, you also come down. In the next year, Harold Wilson stopped helping financially. But Pegler didn't quit, he continued his journey. But a little while later he ran out of money. He heard that there would be an event called British Week, where they celebrate British things. So Pegler decided to go to San Francisco to join that event. Flying Scotsman fit right in. He was the most famous tourist attraction in the whole city for the first few days. But soon they started to receive complaints about Flying Scotsman. So Pegler decided to move the locomotive. But that would be a disaster. Less and less people visited. Now Pegler was completely out of money. And now Flying Scotsman was stranded. William McAlpine stepped in. He bought the locomotive. In February 1973, Flying Scotsman arrived at the same spot where they set sail to the USA 3.5 years ago. But their travels left some spots on the locomotive. Flying Scotsman was on the way back to get restored. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people walked him overjoyed to see Scotsman back on British rails. The next 15 years after being restored to his former glory, he was a reminder of the glorious golden age of steam. The world around Scotsman was chang fast. In the 1980s, technology was booming. But the famous 60-year-old locomotive was still proudly riding the main line at 75 miles per hour. In 1988, Flying Scotsman was heading to Australia. He started his journey on September 1988 and arrived in Sydney a few weeks later. In the first 2 months alone, 130,000 people paid to see the famous locomotives. Even 65-year-old locomotive can do amazing things. Went 422 miles. Without stopping even. He got in the record books once again. When the National Railway Museum bought Scotsman, it was discovered in 1993 that he needed a major overhaul before he would start working. And after 10 years of hard work, Flying Scotsman was back on the rails. The public was waiting impatiently to see the locomotive after 10 years. The National Railway Museum was planning a celebratory train from King's Cross to York. But before that, Flying Scotsman needed to prove that he was fit for the long journey. And after lots of testing, Flying Scotsman passed the tests. And the epic 200-mile journey started. After Scotsman's arrival, he received a welcome that the public won't forget. Now Flying Scotsman is back home. And the legend goes on.